Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Gates, I agree with the statement that was made by our chairman that there's no one better suited for the reform that we're looking at and we're hoping for and we're anticipating than you. And I also want to say that in the various incarnations you've had, I've always enjoyed personally working with you. You've gone out of your way to have dinners with individuals and really try to work with us more than anyone else has. So I thank you for that. You know, you observe in 1961 it was 51% of the budget, and it's now 15%. And that's a problem. It's the lowest percentage since World War II, I guess. But that isn't the problem we're addressing today. That is a problem. But what we're talking about is the tooth and the tail. Now, both you and Secretary Hagel sought to shrink the inflated headquarters and major combat command staffs during your respective times as Secretary of Defense. Secretary Carter initiated a targeted 20% reduction in the staff during his deputy deputy secretary. And in August of this year, Deputy Defense Secretary Robert Work sent all services a memo entitled Cost Reduction Targets for Major Headquarters, ordering preparation for a 25% cut in appropriations from 2017 to 2020. I think that's great, and we supported it. In fact, our defense authorization bill has a lot of language in there that says this is what we need to do, and it's a major problem. Let me just ask you to think about something that hasn't been brought up yet. It's an observation that I've made a long time ago, and that is the problem that you have with bureaucracies in general. Bureaucracies don't want to get smaller, they want to grow. It was Reagan who said there's nothing closer to life eternal on the face of this earth than a government agency once formed, and we both remember that. And so every time it seems like that there is a bureaucracy that is asked to reduce its overhead, and that's what we're talking about today, the headquarters, its overhead, they will cherry pick something that they do that the public is so concerned about. Let me give you an example. I've introduced legislation, in fact, I passed legislation that addresses the FAA and their treatment of general aviation. I have a second bill called the Bill of Rights II. I had problems with reams and reams of bureaucrats from that department out lobbying, knowing they had a lot of people out there on their staff. If you look at the FAA, in 1990, the total number of pilots that they regulated, which is primarily what they were doing in the year 2000, was 625 pilots. Today, it's 593 pilots. So the workload is actually reduced. And yet in the year 2000, their budget was $9.9 billion, and then today it's 16. Let's see, it grew from from 9.9 billion to 16.6 billion. So that's an increase of $67 billion. Now, what do they do every time there's some kind of an effort by me on the radio or something else talking about how it is an inflated bureaucracy that doesn't have the workload they had 5 years ago, but their budget is 67% more. Every time they do that, they would say, all right, we'll go ahead and start reducing. What did they reduce? They reduce things that scare people. They reduce the controllers, the number of controllers that are out there. So, and I could give you a lot of examples, but I don't have to because I know that you know this. So is this, how is a way to handle this? I think that should be considered in this whole discussion. And even though I had to leave to another committee hearing, I suspect that part wasn't brought up. What are your thoughts there?
It just so happens, Senator, that in January I have a new book coming out that specifically addresses, the subtitle is Lessons on Change and Reform from 50 Years of Public Service, and it's how you lead and change big bureaucracies and how you bring about change. And one of the elements in that book, for example, is how to use a period of budget stringency to change the way an organization does its business. It creates an opportunity for a leader who's determined to change things and make them better, because you don't have enough money to do all the things that you've been doing, and therefore you have to think about how you do it differently. We had a lot of programs, as we referred to earlier. In a 4-month period, we came up with $180 billion in overhead cuts in the Defense Department over a multi-year period. This was in 2010. Now, some of those cuts created a strong reaction, including here on the Hill. Senator Kane will recall the reaction when I shuttered Joint Forces Command in Norfolk. And I had the entire Virginia delegation on my doorstep, actually in my office. And
the then governor.
and the then governor.
Who was the worst.
But the point I'm trying to make is, first of all, we cut $80 billion out of the Defense Department generally. But what I assigned the services to do was to find $100 billion in cuts on their own, just in the services. But what I did, with the approval of the President, was to tell him, if you find $100 billion, if you find the cut, if you meet the target that I've given you, and then you show me new military capabilities or expanded military capabilities that are actually tooth, I'll give you the money back to invest in those. So they were incentivized. It wasn't a zero-sum game for them where anything they identified they were going to lose, but it forced them to address this tail and tooth issue and created both penalties if they didn't achieve the goals, but an incentive for them to find and be successful in the effort. One of those things, and it goes to one of the questions that the committee is addressing, the number of general officers. As part of that exercise, we took an initial swipe at senior leadership in the department. And our objective, and this is one of those things you start and you never know whether it came out, but we proposed cutting 50 4-star positions, or 50 general officer positions. And I think twice that number of senior civilian positions. You can do this, but the thing that it requires, whether it's the FAA or the Defense Department or any place else, it requires the person in charge to monitor it almost daily and to make sure that people are doing what they said, what they signed up to do, or the assignment that they were given. In effect, you have to regularly grade your homework. You can't tell somebody, you can't tell a service secretary, I want you to cut $25 billion in overhead over the next 5 years, and then a year later ask him how he's doing. What you need is to ask him in 2 weeks, what's your plan? And in a week after that, or 2 weeks after that, how are you doing on implementation? So you can do these things, Senators. You can make these bureaucracies work. And that's kind of the thesis of the book, but it's kind of, how do you do that? Because it clearly is not done very often. And one of the things that I did, and for which this committee expressed a great deal of appreciation at the time, was actually holding people accountable. You know, people get fired in Washington all the time for scandals and doing things wrong and that kind of stuff. Hardly anybody ever gets fired in this city for just not doing their job well enough.
Yeah, good for
I mean,
you.
that's what was rare, was somebody getting fired because they didn't do their job well enough. You need a little bit more of that in this city.
Yeah, well, my time has expired, but that's a great answer to that question, and I appreciate it. And by the way, I'll swap you books because I have a chapter in mine on this, too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.